Good evening and welcome to this roundtable. Today we'll talk about mollusks, crustaceans, fish, algae, and the role they may have in tomorrow's diet. They represent only 7% of the proteins that we eat today, but someday, and in about 50 years, we could eat more proteins from fish than from land animals. And we need to really think about that if we want to preserve diversity on our continents. Of course, they're full of proteins, of fatty acids, of micronutrients, and aquatic products guarantee nutritional security in many countries. There is already more aquaculture than fishing to fill our plates. So, will tomorrow's diet be more sustainable, healthy, and affordable? Tonight, there will be four speakers with us in France and in South Africa. Jacques Berger is a researcher at IRD in the Joint Research Unit QUALISUD, is a specialist of human food and nutrition. Rita SAHYOUN is a director of the Marine and Fisheries Program at WWF-France. Mariah Darias is a researcher at RD in South Africa. She's a specialist of aquatic animal physiology and nutrition, and she's currently working at the South African Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environment. She's leading the research network for sustainable marine aquaculture in Africa, AfriMAQUA, and the co-project leader of the LIMAQUA laboratory. Brett Macy is a researcher with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment of South Africa. He's a scientist specialized in aquatic animal health and welfare and a partner of IRD and co-project leader of the LIMAQUA program. He will be speaking in English and translated into French. And you can listen to the translation if you need translation. In the first part of this roundtable, we will talk about why aquatic foods are important for humans. And to introduce this issue, we will now watch a video.
Our oceans, lakes, and rivers are precious. We are at a turning point for our oceans. The next 10 years represent a critical opportunity to accelerate international efforts and achieve the goal of sustainable fisheries and aquaculture. That's why this year's State of World Fisheries and Aquaculture report is focused on sustainability in action. The report highlights major trends in global fisheries and aquaculture and also scans the horizon for new and emerging strategies to better manage aquatic resources sustainably into the future. The sector is at the core of Sustainable Development Goal 14, which calls for the conservation and sustainable use of the oceans, seas, and marine resources. Progress is being achieved, but challenges remain. While 65.8% of fish stocks are harvested sustainably, the remaining 34.2% are overfished. Fisheries management is therefore more crucial than ever. Totaling 179 million tonnes. Fisheries alone reached 96.4 million tonnes, while aquaculture production reached 82.1 million tonnes, or even more if you include aquatic algae. This is good news for the billions of people who rely on fish as a primary source of protein, and the millions who earn their livelihood working in fisheries and aquaculture. Women play an important role in this labour force, especially in the post-harvest sector. Beyond the nutrition and employment benefits, fish has also become one of the most traded commodities in the world in recent decades, with developing countries taking on an increasingly important role in this arena. As such, fisheries and aquaculture have an indispensable function in society that we simply cannot take for granted. The world must work together to ensure that the generations to come can continue to access this vital source of nutrition and employment, especially as the population continues to grow and global production continues to intensify.
I think this video raised the main issues that have to do with aquaculture. I have a first question for you, Maria. Can you tell us about what's going on today with the production of aquatic foods? Yes, thank you, Yves. Good evening, everyone. As you may know, traditionally, fishing was the main source for aquatic foods. However, fishing has been stagnating for a while, but there is a growth in demand for aquatic foods. And aquaculture has developed, and since 2015, more than half of aquatic products that we consume come from aquaculture. And this is actually still growing. Aquaculture is the food sector that has been growing the most today. About 90% of fishing comes from the seas, and a lot of aquaculture comes from fresh water. China is the first producer currently, and 60% of aquaculture production comes from China. Aquaculture is mainly about fish, and there are many different species that are bred. And to talk a little bit more about fishing, about 2,000 species of fish are fished, but aquaculture is basically breeding 600 species, and only 27 species represented 90% of the world production of aquaculture. So what's the main species? Well, freshwater fishes, for example, tilapia from the Nile River, and catfish, and algae and mollusks. And what aquatic foods do we consume? Well, it's something that has been growing fast. We eat more fish today than before. And there will still be a growth in the products that we consume. And people who have more purchase power actually eat more fish. And we estimate that consumption of aquatic foods will grow. And the thing is, there's a population growth as well. So we need more products from aquaculture to answer to the needs of the people. Aquatic foods are very important in the diets of many African countries, and we need to think about that because, as I said, there's population growth as well. Thank you. That's all for me. Thank you, Maria. Jacques Berger, I have a question for you. And I would like to say first that people watching us can ask questions. We will ask your questions to the speakers at the end of the first part of this roundtable. So please feel free to send us your questions. And now I have a question for Jacques. You are a specialist of nutrition. Do human beings need aquatic products to be healthy? Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for this question. Maybe a few words first. I am a specialist in nutrition, and what matters to me is that people can have a diversified diet, a healthy diet, a sustainable diet that takes into account the needs in micronutrients for people depending on their age. So to talk a little bit about aquatic foods or aquatic products, well, plants or algae are a source of subsistence for about 800 million people, for rural communities, indigenous community, coastal communities, and it's a very important source of nutrients. And many communities depend on these nutrients and these products. Fish are categorized in the same category as chicken, actually, because they're rich in protein. But they're actually more interesting than land animals because these proteins are actually better for people, for the environment, and because their micronutrients are better. So fish and other aquatic animals provide quality fatty acids, for example, and they are main source of fatty acids for almost 3 billion people in the world. So it's really an important source for fatty acids, for micronutrients, like I said, and a lot of the time it's the only source for people living in the south. And recently there was a report that was published showing that the top 7 of products rich in these elements are actually marine based. So essential fatty acids like omega-3, for example, that are very important, that vitamins as well, like B12. Usually you can only find B12 in animal-based products, and mollusks are really rich in B12, for example. Calcium as well, and magnesium is something that you can find in these aquatic products. And I'm sure we will talk about this. I gave you a few numbers, but the concentration of these nutrients can really depend on the quality of the product, on the species as well, and on the parts of the organisms that you actually consume, on the body parts, if you will. So there are many different kinds of organisms, and they can all give different nutrients, like algae. I'm sure we'll talk about this later. Can be an interesting source of nutrients. So personally, I'm interested in the composition in terms of nutrients of these animals, and obviously I'm really summing things up here. Of course, we eat fish, shellfish. It's an important part of our diet. But if you take a look at the nutritional needs, we could actually replace these products by other products. But in middle income countries and low income countries, if you want, it is absolutely necessary that these products are in their normal diet. Otherwise, they do not have a way to complement their diet with something else. It's really about means of subsistence, about survival. And let's not forget that there are many issues as well with these products. For example, there can be chemicals that are toxic in the fish. Bacteria can be an issue as well, and other dangerous products that you can find, carcinogenous products, for example. So the composition of the product is actually really important, and that was just a way of introduction for this
Merci
topic.
pour
Thank
ce
you.
panorama introductif.
Thank you
Vous avez
very
dit plein de
much
choses
for
sur
these
lesquelles
remarks. You said
j'espère qu'on
many
pourra
interesting
revenir.
things.
On veut nous
Hopefully,
montrer une
we can
petite
talk
vidéo
about
à
it
ce
again
stade
later. We wanted to show you
sur
another video
petite échelle
at this
versus grande
point, if
échelle.
you don't mind.
Si la
It's
régie
about
peut m'envoyer
different
un caméra
scales.
pour la suite du
Our
débat.
small actions can have big impact, like a ripple effect. Small-scale fishing and aquaculture can bring food to one family and provides healthy nutrition to millions more. It brings value to all. Small-scale fishers and fish farmers also know what it means to preserve the balance in our ecosystem. But our livelihoods are at risk. Now, more than ever, we need to be resilient, include us in decisions that affect us, and we will adapt and innovate with the changing tide. We may be small in scale, but our way of life will keep on making a difference and spread like ripples in the water.
Voilà une vidéo intéressante.
So this was an interesting video.
Pas seulement des nutriments,
Aquatic foods are
aussi,
not
des
only
emplois également
nutrients,
pour de nombreux
aquatic
gens,
foods mean
dont
jobs for
Jacques
many
parlait
people.
tout à l'heure.
Jacques
Rita
mentioned it
SAHYOUN,
before.
est-ce que vous
Rita
pouvez nous donner un
SAHYOUN, I have a
ordre d'idée
question
de
for you.
combien de gens sur notre planète
Can you tell
vivent de
us
la
how
pêche
many
et de
people
quel
on the
type de
planet
pêche
live
s'agit-il?
of fishing and what
Oui,
kind of
bonjour à tous.
fishing?
Aujourd'hui, plusieurs
Yes,
milliards de
hello
personnes
everyone.
dépendent de la pêche
Billions
pour
of people
nombreuses
actually
questions alimentaires
depend on fishing
ou comme
for their
source de
diet, but
revenus.
also as an
59
income.
millions de personnes sont
59
employées
billion
directement
people
par le
are
secteur de la pêche et
directly
de l'aquaculture.
employed by the
Ces
fishing sector
personnes se
or
trouvent
aquaculture sector.
essentiellement dans des
These
pays en
people
développement.
usually live in
85%
developing
se trouvent
countries,
en Asie, 9% en
85%
Afrique et le
in
reste dans les
Asia,
continents africains.
9% in Africa, and the
Et là, on
rest
parle vraiment
in
de petits
the other
pêcheurs
parts of the world. And we're
et de
talking about
travailleurs de
small
l'aquaculture.
scale
Et dans le monde, on
fishermen
trouve
and
différents types de
aquaculture.
pêche.
So there are
Ce
different
type de pêche, il est
kinds
défini par
of
euh,
fishing and
un des moyens de
fisheries.
définir la pêche, c'est le taille des bateaux.
The
Donc
size of
aujourd'hui,
boats is a way to define the
90% des
different
bateaux de pêche
categories
dans
of
le
fishing.
monde qui sont
85% of the
motorisés
boats in the
sont
world
de taille
are
inférieure à 12
motorized
mètres, donc
and
inférieure
they
à la
are a
petite barque
size
et
that
de
is
la pêche
smaller
artisanale.
than 12
Et
meters. So it
ces
is
bateaux-là, on les trouve
small
essentiellement
scale
en
fishing.
Asie et puis
These
en Amérique
boats
latine et
are
méridionale.
mainly in the Caribbean,
Face
in
à
Latin
cette petite
America,
pêche
and in Asia.
artisanale,
So
on
there's
a
this
uniquement 3% des
small
bateaux de pêche motorisés qui sont de
small
taille
scale fishing, if you want,
supérieure à
but there
21
are
mètres.
boats that
Donc,
are
pas que
over
ces pêches au
20
large
meters long,
qui concernent la
and
pêche industrielle
this is
où on les trouve
industrial
en
fishing,
Océanie,
if you
en
will,
Europe et en Amérique du Nord.
offshore fishing, and these
Si on
boats
regarde ce qui
usually
se
are in
passe au
North
niveau de la
America.
Méditerranée, et plus
And
spécifiquement
what's
en
happening in the
Méditerranée
Mediterranean
française,
Sea and in the French
la petite
Mediterranean
pêche côtière,
Sea,
elle est
um,
prédominante dans celle-ci.
it's mostly
Elle a
small
un
scale
volet
fishing,
socio-économique
artisanal
et
fishing.
culturel très
It's
important.
got a
On
cultural
parle de petite
role
pêche
as well in
côtière.
France.
Il
So
s'agit d'une pêche
coastal
qui est
fishing, if you
pratiquée
want,
par des
is
bateaux de moins de 12
fishing
mètres
that
et qui
people
sortent
will
en mer
practice with boats that are smaller than
pendant
12
24 heures.
meters
Et donc
long,
une
and
pêche
they
dans les
only
eaux
go
côtières
out
pendant les 12
to
000
this
nautiques.
to sea
Alors
for
cette
about
pêche-là,
24
qui a un
hours.
rôle
This kind
important,
of fishing
majeur
has
dans
an
cette zone,
important
on
role in
emploie
this
aujourd'hui en
area,
France
and they are today in
1200
France
personnes directement
1,200 people
dans le secteur.
working in this
Et si on
industry,
considère
in this
qu'un emploi
sector,
à la mer génère
and
3 emplois
one job
à
at
terre,
sea
on
creates
emploierait
3
environ
jobs on
3500
land. So there
personnes.
are about 300,
Cette pêche-là, elle est
3,600
pratiquée avec une
people working in this
diversité
sector in
de
France.
métiers
So there's
sur
a
des ordres
diversity
techniques
of
différents,
jobs in the
mais qui
sector,
ont des techniques
people
basiques,
with different
c'est-à-dire le
techniques, but
filet,
usually there are
le
soft
casier.
techniques like
Cette technique-là,
nets.
cette pêche-là, si elle est
This kind of
pratiquée de
fishing, if it
manière
is
responsable,
practiced
elle peut être
responsibly,
aujourd'hui moins
can
impactante sur la ressource
actually have
et les
less
habitats que
impacts
les
on
autres
the
types de pêche.
resources and on the marine
Malheureusement,
areas where it
aujourd'hui,
is
cette
practiced.
activité est face
Unfortunately,
à des
today,
difficultés
this kind
majeures.
of activities
Avant tout, la
is
surexploitation dans les
facing many
ressources
challenges. For
à
example,
cause des
there
pratiques
is
non durables et
overfishing
illégales,
because there are
mais aussi
illegal
d'autres
practices
facteurs
that are not sustainable,
comme la
and there are
pollution, le
different
changement climatique
factors like
et le développement
pollution,
d'autres
climate
usages
change, and
euh,
the fact that marine areas are used for other types of activities, especially in the Mediterranean Sea. So the future of these small-scale fishermen and their families is being threatened today, and WWF is working with these people to transform the sector and make it more sustainable.
Merci Rita. Donc on voit bien
Thank
que
you very
là,
much, Rita.
on sort des problèmes nutritionnels pour
So
aussi
we did
toucher aux
not
problèmes
only speak about
socio-économiques
nutrition, you
et
mentioned
puis aux problèmes écologiques.
socio-economic aspects,
Qu'en est-il
environmental
pour
aspects as
l'aquaculture,
well.
Brett
What about
Martin? Est-ce que
aquaculture,
vous
Brett? Can you
pouvez
tell us a little
essayer
bit
d'estimer
about
pour nous
aquaculture?
la
Can you maybe
diversité de
try
l'aquaculture
to
mondiale
describe the
qui est
diversity of
incroyablement variée?
aquaculture in the world, because it's quite diverse, right?
Correct. Thank you, Eve, and good evening, everybody from South Africa. And I just want to welcome and thank all of you for listening in on today's discussions. So, to answer your question, Eve, you are absolutely correct. There are a number of different types of aquaculture systems and species that are cultivated globally. And these can be quite variable, and they depend on a number of factors that include things like the local climatic conditions, availability of space, topography of the region. And I also think to a large extent, these types of systems and species also depend on cultural preferences. So most aquaculture production today, as pointed out already by Maria, still takes place in Asia, where in fact more than 85% of total global aquaculture production still occurs. And I think this is mostly because aquaculture has always been a part of the Asian culture. And I also think the local environment and the conditions are also very conducive to this type of practice. But over recent years, I think societies worldwide are increasingly seeing the benefits of incorporating more fish and even more recently seaweeds, in fact, into their diets. And we've actually seen a dramatic increase in aquaculture production in the Western world, including several European countries and also in the Americas. And likewise, we've also seen a significant increase in production on the African continent, albeit that most of this production is freshwater, most notably tilapia in countries such as Egypt, and to a lesser extent, catfish in countries such as Nigeria. And again, as Maria pointed out, marine aquaculture production only constitutes a very small fraction of aquaculture production on the African continent. Now, the types of production systems in the different countries can also be very different and quite variable. Production systems can range from very high-tech types of production systems that are capital intensive. These can include things like offshore cage culture operations, as well as land-based, either partial recirculating or fully recirculating aquaculture systems, right the way to the other spectrum, where you can get much more simpler, less expensive pond culture systems and net pens. Now, pond culture is probably the most prevalent type of aquaculture that takes place on the African continent as well as in Asia. And as mentioned earlier by Jacques, this provides a very important source of protein as well as supplementary income for many households in these countries. Now, production from these types of systems has typically been dominated by a lot of small to medium-sized producers. But there has definitely been a shift in recent years to more intensive types of production. A very good example of this on the African continent is Egypt, where we've seen a large increase in tilapia production, following a shift from many small-scale producers to larger-scale, more intensive types of production systems. Conversely, production systems in Europe are often very high-tech, and they're also very expensive, and they don't employ too many staff. And just zoning in a little bit on South Africa, pond-based aquaculture is not really prevalent. particularly in the marine sector. And we also don't see too many small to medium-based community farms, as we see elsewhere in Africa and in Asia. In South Africa, aquaculture is very much dominated by marine aquaculture, and is also focused on high-value species such as oysters, mussels, and abalone, where we see oysters and mussels cultivated on rafts in sheltered bays. And in fact, there are not many sheltered bays along the coastline of South Africa, and we also have a very high energy coastline, which I think has partly led to a focus on higher valued species and land-based cultivation. But again, I think it's worth mentioning that the types of aquaculture that do occur in South Africa are very labor intensive, and as a result, they employ a lot of people. Thereby providing income and employment to a lot of people, particularly to the poorer coastal communities where, in fact, several of these aquaculture farms are based. So in summary, the types of aquaculture systems and the species that are cultivated globally, as well as the amount of people that they employ, I think can be very different from country to country and even from region to region. And as I've explained, this is dependent on a wide range of factors.
Thank you very much, Brett. Thank you for this overview of aquaculture diversity. It is indeed quite broad depending on countries, continents, traditions, types of companies involved. And I think that with these 4 comments from 4 different speakers, we have now an overview of today's topic, and I'd like us to talk about fisheries to start with. And it's state today. And to introduce it, there's a video on fish crisis and the situation in Africa, and you'll see that it is quite a striking video. The video is coming now. So my name is Misi Musungu Mandevu, and I've been a fisher since 1994 until today. And I noticed that the yield over the years have been lower and lower. And before there used to be 5 to 6 canoes, and we were just working with our nets. And today there's approximately 100 of us, and our revenue has strongly decreased. Today, some small fish are being caught, and other fishers are using mosquito nets. They use nets with smaller mesh, and that's a big issue today. I'm from the Mituku tribe, and when we were children, we used to fish with pointed sticks, and we'd stab at random on the banks of the river, and we'd be able to catch lots of fish. And today, if you try this fishing practice, you won't be able to catch many fish. And it's the people who are catching small fish with smaller nets that are causing this crisis. Today, for instance, we started working at 5:30. We have deployed the nets twice, and we only caught 3 fish. And in the past, in one day, we'd cast the net 3 times during the day, and we'd go home happy. And feeding and schooling our children today is becoming a headache, and it's now difficult to feed our families. And in the past, before 8 in the morning, I was already able to send 2 parcels of fish to feed my family, 2 parcels with 24 fish in each. And along with them, I'd be able to send the money for flour, salt, palm oil, and other things. And today, you can spend all day working, and you'd only catch 4 to 5 fish. I'm angry because we used to be able to catch more fish in the past. And there's a big difference between today and the past years. It's becoming hard to catch fresh fish, and my children were used to eat fresh fish with a good sauce, and now they can only eat vegetables. So this video is about freshwater fishing, but it describes a situation that is similar in the oceans. Rita, fishing is reaching a plateau in terms of catch, and it is not environmentally friendly. Is this industry still sustainable? Unfortunately, today, bad practices and over-harvesting are very much present in the fishing sector. Fisheries have become more and more intensified in the past 60 years, and it has led to over exploitation of resources, and a third of fish today in the world are over harvested, up to 87% in some areas such as the Mediterranean. So several factors are explaining, are contributing over harvesting, overfishing to start with. That is explained by a growing demand in fish, and this is much higher than the production capacity of oceans. Overfishing can be explained by the fishing boats overcapacity and industrial boats to catch fish. It can also be explained by subsidies, governmental subsidies that are funding this type of fishing. And today, there are too many boats. Boats are too big, too efficient. They use sensors to catch more fish, and it can have an impact on deep seas. And on top of this, there's illegal fishing that represent 28% of global catch, mostly practiced in high seas and in the coastal areas of countries where regulations and controls are quite low. So illegal fishers are using illegal practices such as explosives and poison, and on top of this, social issues can explain practices on certain boats such as slavery. In Europe, today, we are importing 70% of fish products. They mostly come from developing countries, and 1 fish out of 6 that we eat on our plates could come from an illegal source, could have transited through mafia networks and be a product of illegal fishing. So it can participate in the overexploitation of resources, of ecosystems. It's a threat to food security, but also to the economic balance of fish products, of sea products markets. Today, we are still using non-selective fishing products that are used by most fisheries in the world. It is leading to bycatch of small fish and of marine species that are threatened, such as shark, turtles, or seabirds. And these species are caught and then released in at seas, most of the time dead. An estimation of 10% of birds, fish that are caught and then released at sea on the international level. For instance, the example of the tropical shrimp with trawlers. For 1 species of shrimp, 10 bycatch are caught in those nets. Certain trawlers are raking the bottom of the seas and are catching species with a very low reproduction rate, and it's generating a high rate of rejection at sea. So this type type of activity is definitely not sustainable. You're describing a situation that is quite striking. Is there a solution to this to reduce bycatch? Yes, there are technological solutions that can improve this ecological footprint. Many tests were carried out, many mechanisms were tested to improve these situations. For instance, on shrimp trawlers, a mechanism is used so that we can prevent the bycatch of marine turtles. It's called the TED turtle excluder device. And today, using a TED on a trawler would prevent the catch of 97% of the marine turtles when tropical shrimps are being caught. Other types of devices, such as, for instance, fingers that are releasing acoustic signals to deter dolphins from getting closer to trawlers and to reduce bycatch. But that's a mechanism, that's a device that can be improved today. The example of type of hooks that are used to scare sharks by emitting an electrical field with a low intensity, and can only be detected by rays and sharks. And to conclude, of course, artificial intelligence and satellite-based monitoring to fight against, to combat illegal fishing, and it can be used to monitor the oceans. So with all these devices, these mechanisms in place, are fisheries improving, or is it still stagnating despite all these efforts? We can't say no progress were made, but it depends on the oceans and the geographical area we are talking about. So for instance, in the northeastern part of the Atlantic Ocean, on one hand, fishing was regulated by the common fishing policy that was implemented, and now we are reaching 50% of fish that are scientifically assessed that are in good states, thanks to this policy. The example of the red tuna in the Atlantic, it's a species that was reaching its limit in the 90s, that was about to be threatened. And thanks to NGOs and to quotas, relying on scientific recommendations and combined with an effective control, this species has switched from being threatened to being of a minor concern. So some progress, but they're not enough. And then the example of some fisheries that have implemented improvement projects to improve their practices. So they have defined targets with an action plan so that they can improve the management of their fisheries and improve their practices and use fishing devices that have a lower impact on the ecosystem. Thank you very much. Jacques, you wanted to add something on the importance of aquatic resources for the most vulnerable populations? Yes, indeed. The question is, in my studies, I start with the situation in the fields, what type of food, traditional foods that exist so that we can then improve the situation. So for instance, in the fishing sector, since we're talking about fisheries, Rita has just talked about fisheries, in the fishing areas, populations, when they don't live far from the coast, can consume fish, and they can have a diet that is using fish, and we see it mostly in the coastal areas, people on the beach, people, older people, young people, the most vulnerable populations that can have access to a diversified diet. Can be through fish that are not sold, but that are caught, and people who can survive by fishing in rivers or other places. And today, these people that used to be able to fish in rivers are struggling to feed their families. That's what we saw in the video. And there's an example in Benin, for instance, and it's the case for Asia and Africa. The number of fish that are not used, I'm not talking about frozen fish, but fish that are preserved with artisanal practices by smoking it, drying it. And we see that the share of dried fish represent 25% of fish that are consumed in Asia. So 25% of fish that are dried and not fresh are consumed in Asia. And the same in Africa, for instance, in Benin, many women are going to buy the fish that are not sold at the end of the day, so the smaller fish, and very often they're dried and smoked whole, and they're used in many types of dish. And the fact that they're introduced in this form means that they are very nutritive, because micronutrients are not only in the body of the fish, they can very often be found in the head or the guts of the fish, and that's allowing more micronutrients in people's diet. So we need to take this into account. It can't be put aside. It needs to be used so that, for instance, be inspired by what is practiced in Africa, and that has helped populations improve these drying and smoking techniques so that we can decrease the use of carcinogenous products that can be used in the smoking practices, and use more traditional practices by using wood, for instance, or other types of energies that are needed to dry fish. So that's about fisheries. But let's have a look at freshwater fish. I have worked for 9 years in Vietnam, and that's a country where fish is part of people's lives, culturally speaking, even far from the coast. So Vietnamese people buy fish alive in containers at the market. And they fish coming from small-scale aquaculture that Brett was talking about, people who are farming fish in containers in their gardens, and it comes from this VAC system, farms that have a pond, have a garden, have rice fields, some animals like chickens, pigs, and they use all the materials, the feces from these animals, and it's used as fertilizers. It can feed fish, and then the fish themselves are feeding the families, and it allows the family to be able to consume these nutrients and these fish. What's innovative here, and there's a study, a project that we carried out in Vietnamese with a Vietnamese NGO, and it was led by one of my colleagues there. We used fish, for instance, fish are affordable 4 to 5 months a year for people, and then they're too expensive. So we wanted to use the waste, fish waste, small fish, worked with fishes to make fish meal. And with this NGO and the fish meal that we made, we used it to make a fish paste, and we roll them in a way. Cambodians love fish, and so we sold this fish paste, sold it on markets, and it was consumed a lot. And this food was then used by national programs to combat malnutrition with UNICEF, and they received an award for this initiative, an initiative that comes from, it's not a unique essential food, it's fish-based, but it allowed to bring an added value to this small fish and to manufacture a product from small fish and to feed a whole part of the population, give access to fish nutrients when they did not have access in the past. Okay, we're going to continue. Thank you for having explained this diversity of practices. It's fascinating. I'd like us to talk about aquaculture in more details, because we talked a lot about fisheries, and we're going to watch a video, and it will show Brett Macy in action. Hopefully we can see this video, and it will be a good introduction to aquaculture.
Dr. Brett Macy. I work for the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. I'm a scientist in the department working in the Directorate of Aquaculture Research and Development. The research that I'm currently involved in is focused around developing sustainable marine aquaculture practices. We are currently at the Marine Research Aquarium in Sea Point in Cape Town. We have a team that's working on an aquatic animal health component, and that's a component that I'm primarily involved in. More than 85% of marine species are either fully exploited or severely over-harvested. So aquaculture has been identified as a very important source of protein. I think it's very important that we need to develop technologies that would make a lot of those practices more sustainable. The sea urchin, the species occurs along our coastline. It's a high-valued species. There's a huge market for it in the Far East. We've been doing quite a bit of work on developing technologies for all life stages of this animal, and also developing feeds for this animal so that it can be produced in a sustainable manner. We've focused very strongly on looking at integrated technologies where we can grow this system in combination with seaweeds so that the seaweeds can recycle nutrients. The seaweeds produced in the system can then be fed back to the animals. It is an IRD funded project. The whole premise of the project is to try and bring together experts and researchers from the region, and to try and get all these people to work together, address some of these bigger themes and the larger needs for sustainable development of aquaculture on the continent. I wouldn't say that I always wanted to be a scientist. I moved to the coastline when I was about 16 years old. And I think the first time that I actually went into the water and snorkeled around in rock pools was really the first time that I actually fell in love with the marine environment and really realized the potential that the marine environment holds.
Brett, it was really nice to see you in that video. So issues of pollution are important in aquaculture. Are you very interested in that topic? Can you tell us a little bit more about these problems? What are the possible solutions to fight pollution?
Yeah, thanks, Eve. So I think what I'll do is I'll try and touch on a couple of things that I think can potentially have an impact on the sustainability of the industry, and perhaps look at what some of the solutions are. So we've heard this evening already that aquaculture production has grown rapidly, and it's going to continue to grow rapidly each year. And I think since 2000, we've seen about a 6 to 7% increase in growth rate annually. So with this growth, I think the industry has made great strides to reduce the impact that it has on the environment. But the growth of aquaculture still raises a number of questions in relation to the resources that it consumes, including things like space, feed raw resources, in particular fish meal, which has already been mentioned this evening. And the industry can also have a direct impact on the surrounding environment as a consequence of waste production. So through things like feeds that are not being used optimally, excretion by the animals themselves, and even biofouling that can occur on the equipment that farmers use, and even on some of the animals. And then, of course, another factor that can also affect sustainability is disease on farms, and that can obviously have an impact on the animals in the surrounding environment. So how do we improve the sustainability of aquaculture? So I'm going to touch a little bit on feeds for about a few seconds. So improving sustainability of feeds has actually been a major research topic for several years now. Feeds and nutrition are of central importance to the economics and the environmental sustainability of aquaculture. Also, they can represent one of the major costs of the production of many species. So it's therefore vitally important that feeds are formulated properly and designed specifically to meet the nutritional needs of the species that have been cultivated. And we also need to try and produce these feeds as sustainably and as cheaply as possible. So poorly formulated feeds can obviously reduce the growth rates of the animals. They can increase waste outputs into the system. They can reduce water quality, and this can ultimately increase stress on the animals within the system, and potentially lead to increased incidences of disease, and obviously in turn impact the surrounding environments and the organisms that occupy these environments. So in order to improve sustainability of aquaculture, we need to focus on identifying alternative, more environmentally sustainable, as well as cheaper sources of protein. And obviously formulate these feeds so that they meet the nutritional needs of the animals, so that they are utilized properly and more efficiently. Now also, and I've mentioned this in my video clip that you just saw, another way of improving sustainability is obviously changing the way that we actually farm. So for example, a lot of research has been focused on the development of innovative, integrated, multi-trophic aquaculture technologies, otherwise known as IMTA. So some of you are not familiar, might be asking, what is IMTA? And this is basically the sustainable production. It is a sustainable production method where multiple complementary species from different trophic levels are combined within the same system or in the same water body, and the wastes from one crop, which is generally the fed species such as fish, can then serve as fertilizers, food, or energy for other crops that are held in the system or in that water body. And these include extractive species such as mollusks, echinoderms, and more recently a lot of seaweeds have been incorporated into these integrated systems. Now, and not only do these types of systems or the co-products, from these systems can obviously also be sold on the markets. So not only do these types of systems improve the sustainability of the farming practices, but they can obviously also increase the profitability of these farming practices. And you would have seen from the video clip that our group has also done quite a bit of research into these IMTA. particularly with the utilization of seaweeds in these systems. And we've shown that seaweeds incorporated into these systems can also dramatically improve health of the systems, health of the animals grown in these systems. They can reduce production costs, and obviously they can reduce the impacts on the environment. And I think it's also worth indicating that in these types of IMTA systems, one can also focus on lower trophic species, which again further improves sustainability. So as I mentioned earlier on, I think these are just a couple of examples of things that can potentially impact the environment, impact sustainability of aquaculture, and also just a few examples of ways in which we can improve the sustainability. But I think to finish off, I just want to say that if one wants to focus on improving overall sustainability and profitability of farms, one needs to use sort of a systems approach where we look at the system as a whole, because all the different components within these systems are obviously interconnected. And as we start fiddling with one component within the system, it's going to have an impact on the other parts of the system. So using a system approach and also using a multidisciplinary sort of approach to achieve the sustainable or sustainability objectives, in my opinion, is very important.
Thank you very much. Yes, you are right. This is really a holistic approach. Mariah, can you tell us a little bit more about nutrition? We're interested in that topic. Why is nutrition so important? Well, it's important because aquatic foods are the main cost in this sector. And feeds are actually one of the major elements that needs to be taken into account to evaluate the consequences on the environment. We have talked about fish meal before, about fish oil. And again, we talked about the fact that aquaculture is a growing sector. So there's a high pressure on natural resources, natural stocks, and there are ecological and environmental risks linked to that, but there are also social risks because again, fish is an important part of the diet of many people, especially in developing countries. So in this context, aquaculture has actually progressed in the last 20 years. The sector has tried to use less fish resources. For example, they are now breeding more omnivorous fish. They use fish meal and fish oil that come from waste of fish transformation and from bycatch. And they are using alternative ingredients like plants. So aquaculture production has tripled in 20 years, but a fish that is harvested for aquaculture or actually to produce fish meal and fish oil has actually went actually down by 30%. So for freshwater fish, currently, what is used to feed them contains for about 1 or 2% of fish meal, and for marine fish and crustaceans, the input of fish meal has diminished, was reduced by actually half. But using plants has consequences as well. These ingredients may have consequences on the health of some fish, carnivorous species, for example. So scientists are currently studying the consequences of using these plants. And there is now more pressure on water resources and land resources. There are more carbon emissions that come from plants that are cultivated. There are issues with deforestation, for example. But if we try to think about this, only 96% of fish meal is used to nourish land animals and only 4% to feed fish. There is some other things I would like to say about using plants. So we use plant-based products instead of fish oil. So there is less omega-3 in a fillet. So the nutritional value of the final product is actually not as good. So we are currently doing some research in order to find new ingredients that can be nutritious, but that will not have other consequences, negative effects. And we are currently studying unicellular organisms and microalgae. That's it for me. Thank you very much. Yes, it's not easy to know what we can use to feed all these fish that we are currently breeding. And now there will be a short last part about solutions. I would like to remind people online that they can ask questions. We will ask these questions to our speakers at the end of the roundtable. Jacques, can you tell us a little bit about how we can reinforce the role of aquatic foods in human nutrition? Well, I'll try to be brief. What can we do? I believe that we need to think not only about fishermen or producers, but think about the whole value chain. There's a lot of work to do with people, with different populations. We need to think about all the different uses. Consumers, people who eat these products need to be taken into account from the beginning of each project, and we need to build together. People need to be informed. We need to raise awareness about these products and what they can do for their well-being. But people need to know about the impact on the environment, and they need to know about sustainability. I think there is a lot of work to do in that field. And maybe we can also use knowledge that people have. Maybe there are people that have innovative solutions that could be taken into account. And this is what I do in my work. I want populations, I want communities to be aware of what's happening, what is used for aquaculture, for example, what is used for consumption. And I will be quick. Maybe there could be some actions in different countries. Maybe policymakers have a lot to do. We need to do some lobbying. We need to underline how important aquatic foods are. We need to explain why nutrients from aquatic foods are important. And sometimes the nutritive aspects are limited, and it can have a consequence on our cognitive needs. So we need scientific proof, basically, we need data, and that is why the projects that you are leading are so important. And like it was said, multidisciplinary approaches are important because we need to give access to good information, good scientific data. And Brett, you mentioned this before when you were talking about aquaculture. You talked about systems, and I think people need to understand all of this. And maybe one last point, I think countries should know the specificities of the species that live in their countries and in the different regions. They should not only base their decisions on general knowledge, because there is so much diversity. There's different quality issues with fish. And maybe Maria and Brett will talk about this a little bit later. The environment can have so many consequences on a species. It's something that we have to know about. And one last point, if we take a look at what was done recently uh, on consumption, the fact that fish is in the same category as meat is not enough if we want to raise awareness. Um, Policymakers, international organizations need to know about the specificities of aquatic species. And I think actually this issue should be a priority on the international agenda. Thank you. Thank you very much. You mentioned policymakers before. Can we talk about consumers? Can you talk about maybe certification processes? Can we talk about labeling? Uh, how can we help consumers? Yes, of course, I did not mention this. When you eat aquatic foods, when it is clear that products need labeling, and labels need to be easy to understand. We all need that. When you eat fish that comes from aquaculture, you need to know more information. And I'm looking at Rita because WWF works on these issues. There are labeling processes today, but we have information that tell us that these labels are not enough because some producers apparently can buy the certification and they do not respect the rules. So we still have a lot to do on this point, I think.
Oui, oui, merci Jacques.
Yes,
C'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui,
yes, Jacques, you are
l'éco-certification,
right.
il y a un outil parmi
Eco-certification
d'autres
is
pour,
one tool
qui permet aujourd'hui
amongst
de garantir aux
others.
consommateurs que
It's
ces
a way
produits
to
ils proviennent de
guarantee
pêcheries durables,
that
mais ce
a
n'est pas le
product
seul
comes
parce
from
que
sustainable fishing.
effectivement, dans des
But it's
pêcheries
not the only
artisanales qui n'ont
tool
pas le marché
that we have,
derrière
because some
pour
small
valoriser
fisheries
un produit avec
uh,
un label,
do not have access to
en
some
fait,
categories of
ils n'ont peut-être
labels.
même pas besoin en fait
And sometimes they actually do
d'avoir un
not
label parce
need a
qu'ils
label
peuvent
because these
mettre en
are
place
small
des
scale
pratiques,
fisheries and
des
they
pratiques pour
follow
améliorer la durabilité de la pêcherie
practices that
et
are
même
more
parce qu'ils utilisent
sustainable.
déjà des
And
techniques
also
douces qui
because
n'ont
they
vraiment pas
already
d'impact
use these
sur le
softer
milieu et
techniques
parce que
that do
aussi
not destroy the
l'espèce
environment. And also because
qui est dans cette
sometimes
pêcherie,
the
elle se porte
species
bien en fait
that
dans
is
l'océan.
fished
Donc
by a
tout
small
dépend vraiment
scale
de
fishing
quel type de
company
pêcherie on parle,
um,
dans quelle zone
is
et
not
quelle espèce.
threatened. So it
C'est pour ça
really
qu'il faut
is
vraiment
about
regarder à
what
la fois
species,
l'état de
where
l'espèce
you need
dans
to
la mer,
know
comment elle
about
se porte, l'état de
what's going
santé,
on
mais
with a
aussi
specific
les pratiques,
species.
les
Is it a
techniques qui ont
healthy
été
stock?
utilisées et leur impact
And
sur des
obviously, the
crises
different fishing
accessoires
techniques have
recaptation,
different
etc., sur
impacts
leur
on
impact sur le fond
cetaceans, for
marin, mais
example.
aussi regarder s'il y a vraiment
Um,
des mesures de gestion
and
mises en
we
place
need to
pour
make sure
garantir la
that
durabilité. Donc
companies
aujourd'hui,
do take
dans les pays très
measures to make
sous-développés, il y a
sure that they are
aucun
becoming
label
more
sur certains
sustainable. There are
poissons.
so many
Et
different
donc,
labels today in
il y a des
France
labels qui sont
as
plus
well.
pour la
Some
qualité et d'autres
labels are
plus
about
sur sur la
quality,
durabilité.
some are
Et
about
donc, moi, je pense qu'il faut
sustainability,
citer
and
un des
I can
labels
mention maybe
où
one
il reste le
label.
label plus
And
crédible,
for us, it's
robuste
the
et basé sur
more
des données
robust
scientifiques, c'est le
one.
label MSC
It's
aujourd'hui.
based
C'est
on
un label
scientific
vraiment
data. It's the
pour garantir aux
MSC
consommateurs
label,
des pays développés, aussi en
and
France, que leur produit est
it's
issu
a
de
way for
pêcheries durables.
consumers in developed countries to make sure that their
Voilà.
products
Après,
come
pour
from
l'aquaculture, il y a
sustainable
aussi d'autres labels
fisheries.
dans les pays
There are
développés, comme
different
ASC
labels for
ou
aquaculture, like
aquaculture biologique.
ASC, for example, or eco certification.
Aquaculture
eco aquaculture.
Does our expert in aquaculture want to add something on label?
Yes, I would like to just add something on the role of the consumers and also the role of communities. So for me, consumer perspective of aquaculture production is vitally important to the growth of the sector and the impact that we obviously want the sector to have on the provision of food for our growing nations and its contributions to society. So I think it's vitally important that we need to make consumers and communities a part of the journey to grow the aquaculture sector. Since ultimately it's these communities and consumers that will determine the success of our industry. So I think communities need to be very much involved from the onset of the development of aquaculture operations and stuff, particularly in smaller communities. And I think we need to strive to enhance their role and direct involvement in all the existing operations. And I think we also need to try and promote the establishment of community-based farms. So this is often referred to as sort of a social license to operate. And I think if we can improve this, we'll help to improve the success of the industry. And then also in terms of enhancing sustainability of farming practices, and we've touched on this quite a bit already in this evening's discussions, I think it's also vitally important, sustainability. And I think if products can be produced more sustainably and consumers are made aware of this through proper certification, and Rita spoke about the Marine Stewardship Council and the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. So I think with proper certification, labeling, and increased transparency around the products that are being produced across the entire process, essentially from farm to fork, I think we can improve sales of aquaculture products and again, enhance growth of the sector. And lastly, I just want to say, I think it's sort of our responsibility as scientists, together with government agencies, producers and all the other stakeholders in the industry, we need to promote as much awareness of the industry as possible to increase communities and society's knowledge about what we are doing and their basic understanding of aquaculture. And I think through this process, we can hopefully sort of overcome, I think, a lot of the misconceptions that some people have about aquaculture production. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you to all of you. I have a list of questions from our viewers. I'm going to start asking them, as we can't have them wait for much longer. Many questions in particular on the fact that fish in the oceans, in rivers, are very often polluted. We talk about tunas and mercury, talk about plastic pollution. Isn't it an opportunity for aquaculture so that aquaculture provides products of a better quality from fisheries? Yves, I'd like to highlight the fact that if we want to provide population's needs, demand, we are going to need aquaculture. We don't have a choice, actually. And it's true that aquaculture allows us to closely monitor quality and food's biosecurity. With wild fish, it's very hard to assess the level of pollution unless there's an analysis that is carried out. But in aquaculture, with this labeling system, we can be more certain, and the industry can reassure consumers much better. Actually, organic aquaculture already exists, and it's something that is going to be developed with time. Aquaculture is one of the last types of farming that were created, and we learned from other sectors' mistakes. And so we are very well monitored, informed. We are, yes, we are monitored. People who are working in our fields, the different stakeholders, researchers, industrials, all focusing on sustainability and are environmentally friendly. Some viewers are asking if developing aquaculture wouldn't just be a way to relieve the oceans, maybe the best way to do that. Rita, do you think this could be an explanation? Well, yes, but if we're not going to fish anchovies to make turn it into fish meal so that we can feed fish from aquaculture, so we can believe that aquaculture is those solutions, but actually we also exploit small fish so that it can be processed and transformed into fish meal to feed bigger fish. So we need to be mindful of pollution issues in aquaculture, for instance, with salmon in the fjords that are then polluting the surrounding ecosystems. There's lots of issues with aquaculture as well that we need to be mindful about, and we need to find solutions for this as well. And I have a question for Maria, actually, regarding another solution in aquaculture. The attempt to try to feed predator fish instead of feeding them fish meal. Could we feed them seaweeds? Do you have an opinion about this? The fact that we can extract seaweed from seaweeds, the nutrients needed for these carnivorous fish. But just to complete the question, Brett talked about seaweeds as a tool. It's true. And we do talk about this a lot, the use of seaweeds. How can we use seaweeds in aquaculture to improve sustainability? We thought about this issue, about fish meal and fish oil by using seaweeds. For instance, you can feed fish with plant-based feed. For instance, for salmon today, most of the protein intake comes from plants. However, the issue here is that it decreases the intake in omega-3, and so the sector currently is looking for new ingredients so that we can avoid all these issues, plant-related issues. And one of the ingredients is seaweed. Many recent studies on the use of seaweed in food exist, and for carnivorous fish, because for omnivorous fish, we can increase other types of intakes, but for carnivorous fish, some of the seaweed components can't be well digested by fish. So it's the most recent research, and lots of other types of research are going to research the use of seaweed, and I'm talking about microalgae as well that have a high potential for fatty acid intake and bacteria as well, yeast that will provide protein as well. So many different types of research are working on this and diversifying food feed in aquaculture. Very interesting. Brett, would you like to add something?
Yes, I would definitely like to add to that because this is a topic that's very close to my heart. So looking at seaweeds, I think Maria has touched a little bit on its potential use as a supplement for carnivorous fish. And I think one thing that I wanted to add to that, I think we can look at seaweed inclusion in diets from different perspectives. So one way to look at it is potentially as an alternative source of protein. And I think another way is to look at it as a functional feed ingredient. And a lot of the research that I've been doing actually in our group is rather been focused on the role of seaweeds as a functional feed ingredient, where its inclusion in feeds can have a number of impacts, such as improving overall consumption of feed. So if you can do that, you are already also improving utilization of, or better utilization of proteins that are added to feed and reducing waste, which potentially means you need to add less protein into those diets. They can also play a very important role on modulating the microbiome. So these are the bacteria and the fungi and the other microorganisms in the digestive tracts of these animals. And essentially, they're sort of acting as prebiotics, and they can improve overall health of these organisms. That can lead to increased growth of these organisms and can lead to increased disease resistance of these organisms. Which again helps to promote the sustainability aspects of aquaculture. And then also lastly, there are a number of other components within seaweeds that have very positive effects on physiology of animals, have immunostimulatory properties. So there's just a range of benefits, and there's so much literature coming out. Not only showing the positive impacts of seaweeds in diets for animals, but also for humans. There's a plethora of literature out there at the moment. And then before I finish, the other thing as well with seaweeds is also, and I mentioned this early on, if we can grow them with animals in integrated systems, we've found, and a number of people have shown, that it just also improves general health of the system. So it can actually have a modulatory effect on the microbiome, for example, of a system. And as I mentioned earlier, it also has a whole lot of other positive environmental benefits, from bioremediation, for example, increased recirculation on farms because it's able to strip out dissolved nutrients in the system. So yeah, there's a lot of positives from including seaweeds, not only in diets, but also just in systems. Thank you.
Very well, yes, indeed. It's quite promising. Questions are very varied because viewers are interested in varied topics. A question on how to combat illegal fishing, a question that is addressed to you, Rita, maybe more in particular. We live in a period where satellites are very much used. How come it's so hard to combat illegal fishing with all the technological breakthroughs that exist today? Well, it's tricky because to be able to identify where fishers are fishing illegally, there's a system that exists, a system that allows a fish to be spotted in the ocean, and the boat can switch it off. So we can't detect the boat anymore in the ocean, which makes it tricky. And when we talk about illegal fishing, we don't only refer to, we also refer to unregulated fishing. So if there are no measures, regulations that are complied with by fisheries, then this leads to overfishing. And since we can't always control these boats, then we are in a situation of illegal fishing, fishing that is unreported, unregulated, which is also a type of illegal fishing. So it depends on where it takes place. If it's in high seas, then it's harder to control fishing boats than in coastal areas where we have a better access to this type of control. So it all depends on where the ships are. And to truly combat illegal fishing, we need to improve oceans governance. We need to implement control measures, monitoring measures. And a question on the difference between small-scale aquaculture and industrial aquaculture, and more particularly in terms of impact. Can we say that small-scale aquaculture, such as small-scale fishing, would have lower impact, or it's not necessarily the case?
I can have a crack at that one. That's quite an interesting question, actually, because I think they can both actually have an impact, an adverse impact on the environment. So I think one way to look at it as well, I think small-scale aquaculture, if it's practiced in large volumes, so if you have a large number of small-scale producers, and if those small-scale producers are not very well regulated, and I think things like this have actually happened in the past, then I think they can obviously have an adverse impact. So one needs to remember sometimes that the small-scale aquaculture producers don't always have the resources that some of the larger scale producers might have at their disposal in order to control various things to minimize the impacts on the environments. That being said, I think large-scale producers are potentially a lot more heavily regulated. So I think there's a lot more stricter control over what they can do. And I think this regulation is increasing to a degree. So that's not to say that they cannot cause an impact. And most certainly, I think in some instances they do. So like I said earlier on, I think it's a bit of a tricky question. And I don't think there's an answer either way. I think they both can obviously have impacts depending on the scenario.
We're reaching the end of this roundtable. Thank you, Brett. I think, Rita, you're working on a guide for consumers at the WWF. Could you tell us a few words about this?
Oui, tout à fait.
Yes, of course. At WWF, we have launched this consumer's guide so that we can guide consumers. It's in French. On sustainable projects. So we analyze different factors, both the fishing techniques that is used, the farming techniques, the catching area, and the management methods. And by combining these factors, we can rank species with a color code. Green for species that must be valued by consumers, species that have the lowest impact on oceans. Orange is for species that we must consume but moderately, and in red that we need to remove from our diet. And to conclude and to addressing the viewers here, what we recommend our consumers today in general, is to eat less fish, not to consume more than what is recommended by the World Health Organization. So a few grams of fish, up to 3 grams of fish per week, to species that are coming from sustainable fishing or that are certified, and to also favor diversification. So not to always eat the same types of species, because today in France, it's always the same species: cod, tuna, and farm shrimps. So focus on other species that today are more numerous in the oceans, because unfortunately the species that are the most consumed today are the ones that are overfished. And so consumers in France, but also in other developed countries, have a key role to play so that we can drive the whole sector, so that all the stakeholders in the sector are choosing these sustainable practices, improving their practices. Thank you, Rita. Unfortunately, we don't have more time to ask the other questions. I'd like to thank the participants and speakers tonight. We have learned a lot from you. Thank you to all of you. And thank you to the viewers who have listened to this discussion. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Merci, bonne soirée.